And just jump in if the technology is not looking good, Jessica. So
Okay.
so welcome, yes, welcome to Vape Life Liberty and the Pursuit of Fat Clouds. As I'm going to be talking about that, this kind of sums up why kids tend to be vaping, and some of the areas that we are going to need to address if we're going to prevent and intervene in them vaping. So a little bit more about why you should trust anything I have to say about this topic. So I'm coming from Asheville, North Carolina right now, but I commute back and forth to Glastonbury because my partner is up there. So I'm a part-time Connecticut resident. But I am a retired school counselor. It's still weird to say that. So after 23 years of working in schools, and I worked in alternative schools, therapeutic schools, with juvenile justice, pregnant and parenting teens, teens kicked out of all the schools, kind of cut my teeth on those populations, and then worked in charter and private and public schools from elementary through college age. So kind of been in a diversity of environments and kids. I am an adolescent therapist. I specialize in early intervention into addictive behaviors of all kinds, substance use and other things. And I have a parent coaching practice now that crosses state lines, just FYI. And I am focusing now, my side gig has now become the full-time gig. So I became known as the drug lady in my community for teaching drug education kind of on the side with a bunch of schools in the area, and then doing presentations to parents and educators and clinicians. And now the side gig is what I do all the time. So I am here with you. But as Jessica mentioned, is that some of my expertise comes from my own lived experience, is that I was that kid, yes, the hot mess teen, but I was that kid in school that even in elementary and middle school was always really looking for attention and self-soothing and acceptance, and that wasn't always constructive, right? So every report card said if she would just use her powers for good and not evil. So I had those risk factors that we're going to talk about in a minute that that show us that a kid is at risk for developing all kinds of substance use issues and addictive issues. So my the BTDT, by the way, that goes with my fancy letters, came from a student that said, you need some letters to go with your like life experience. So he suggested I put been there, done that on there, and I'm keeping it. So I just want to say this first is that we're going to be whipping through so much information because I'm going to be covering some new school drug ed so that you know what is going on with both THC and nicotine products and how they are impacting growing brains and the hottest, like newest research that isn't even Googleable yet. And then we're going to talk about prevention, and then we're going to talk about interventions. We're going to pack it all in. So just know that a couple things. One is that you are going to get I'm going to take you to a vortex of that I've created a huge Google Doc full of resources for you to build on and implement everything I'm going to be sharing with you. And I'm really easily accessible. And I'm going to make sure that you get a PDF of all of these slides. So even if we move quickly or you have to duck out early, you'll have ways to go back to this information. But so before we get into the parts that can be scary and make us, feel kind of dooming and stressful, let's just establish the hope, right? Is remind ourselves that we know that kids are much less likely to engage in all risky and addictive behaviors, including substance use and including vaping, or develop problems with them when these things are happening. One is that parents have two-way ongoing conversations with with their kids about substances. We know that 12 to 17-year-old kids who've had even one conversation with their parents about the risk of substances use 80% less than those who don't have the conversation. And I was looking for Connecticut specific data, as I always do when I present in a state, and they did a study in Greenwich that showed that teens were 9 times more likely to drink on the weekends if they didn't think their parents disapproved. So we know that when parents also clearly communicate expectations to not engage in risky behaviors or use substances, and that their commitment to step in if they do, that actually makes a difference in kids engaging in them. And when schools provide comprehensive education and restorative discipline. So this means comprehensive ed that covers some of the things I'm going to be talking about, that includes not just drugs are bad, but how to steer through real life, how to apply it to their own lives, and then respond in ways that are holistic, that actually approach the reasons why they're using. So we're going to talk more about that for those of you working in schools. And when kids have a sense of school connectedness, they feel known, cared about, believed in, valued by their school environment. So I know that there's a diversity of folks here. So there are folks that are working in schools, working with schools, that are clinicians, that are prevention specialists, that you might be working in after school programs. So know that some of these principles, when I'm talking about a school environment, this can also work in an agency or in an after school program of some kind as well. Because the bottom line is that when kids feel connected to adults, that is what really matters. So if they're not getting that at home or at school, we can still be that in another environment. So before we can teach the kiddos in our lives accurate facts, we need to have them ourselves. So here's what we need to know. And so this is going to take up probably about a half an hour of our time before we get into what to do with it. So nicotine. Everybody knows about cigarettes, right? That public service announcements, health teachers, really hammered in that cigarettes are bad. They'll kill you and hurt you if you use them. But what we failed to do is educate on, or they failed to do, was educate on the dangers of nicotine in and of itself in any form. So when vaping came along, they took advantage of that. Now that nicotine pouches are here, they have taken advantage of that, of always saying like, well, at least it's not smoking. Well, at least it's not vaping. So kids need to know what any form of nicotine is going to do to their growing brains and bodies. So for one, that nicotine is the most addictive drug in any form. More than crack and heroin and meth, is that one out of like half of middle schoolers who even try nicotine in any form are likely to get addicted to it. And about a third of high schoolers. So specifically for adolescents, for those kids that are in, fifth grade through mid 20s, right? When that brain is still super malleable and growing, and what they put into them not only throws off brain chemistry like it does for adults, it can change these structures and functions of the brain, disrupt the growth of the brain. They need to know that about every substance, including caffeine in regular and heavy amounts. But when it comes to nicotine, what we're seeing is that adolescent nicotine use is disrupting prefrontal cortex development. And so what that leads to is increased impulsivity and deficits with focus and attention and memory and learning into adulthood, not just while they're using now. Also disrupting limbic system circuitry and serotonin production, right? Serotonin being the mood management chemical in the brain, neurochemical in the brain. So without it, we feel stressed and anxious and depressed and have trouble sleeping. So that's what happens, is that kids end up feeling more stressed and anxious and depressed and having trouble with sleeping. But again, not just now, into adulthood. And we're going to put a little pin in that, because we know that a lot of kids who are using because they believe it is helping with those things. They don't realize that they are not only worsening, but causing it. So it is the ultimate gateway drug, meaning that they're showing nicotine in adolescent brains, making changes in reward pathways in a way that actually prime the brain to be more responsive addictively, to get addicted to other substances easier. So a kid is 10 times more likely to develop alcoholism if they started with nicotine, and they're showing the same happening with cannabis. So, we can tell a kid, if you ever want to be somebody that can have a glass of wine or have one of those fruity, the drink in the coconut with the umbrella someday, and walk away from that and just be a responsible drinker, you're kind of screwing your chances if you are choosing to use nicotine now. The nicotine weakens the immune system. So that means that a kid is likely to get sicker, and have a harder time healing. And that whether that's a broken leg or a cut or a runaway zit or a flu. And we're seeing increasing rates of nicotine poisoning. So because of how strong, and I'm about to show you, these vapes are getting, how much a kid can be consuming when they think it just tastes like, rainbow unicorn poop surprise, whatever the flavors are, is that a kid can end up with vomiting and shakiness and dizziness, headaches, diarrhea, rapid heartbeat. All those things are something to look for if a kid presents with those symptoms, for one, that they might be using. And as I said, it can create sleep problems. And because nicotine constricts blood vessels, we need to explain to kids that just because they are not, even if they're not vaping, by the way, it still can hurt your heart and hurt your lungs. Never mind adding that you are breathing in, all of those chemicals. So, but what I will say is a prevention point that sticks sometimes is how nicotine affects the skin, because that means they're not getting nutrients, oxygen, nutrients to the skin, and it will get ruddy and splotchy and wrinkly faster. And sometimes that's the value that kids need to be spoken to, right? So we've got three kinds of devices. The upper left is a refillable tank device, which produces the big fat clouds. That's the ones that they do the tricks with, which kids aren't as likely to bring around adults, like to school or after school, just because of they're not as stealth. And then the pod vapes, like Juul in the lower right, is a rechargeable device with refillable pods or cartridges that have the nicotine liquid in them. And then the disposables that are the rest of these, which are use and toss, and the ones that are most popular with youth. And just a little FYI is these are also starting to fill our landfills, and they are non-recyclable plastic, and they are toxic metals and chemicals going into the earth. So hold on. I know this is shocking. And Jessica, these folks can account as every time I say this piece of data, even though I do it all day, every day, it still shocks me. It's because it keeps on changing. So devices vary in quantity of nicotine and the strength of that nicotine. So while Juuls and the disposable, the originals were about 20 cigarettes worth of nicotine in a device or in a pod, that they are now making them, the average is these 5,000 puffs. You basically take, if it's a 5% nicotine and 5,000 puffs, you divide it by 10 to tell you how many cigarettes worth of nicotine that is. That's the equation. So yes, these 5,000 Elf Bar 5000s are about 500 cigarettes worth of nicotine. Now, they're now making it so that the averages, the most fun ones that our kids can get their hands on, are 20,000 puff devices. But they are making them, I had to change this slide because I had it saying 5,000 cigarettes worth because I had run across the 50,000 puff one. But just last week, I ran across somebody bragging about their 100,000 puff device that is 5 milligrams. Yes, that equates to 10,000 cigarettes or 500 packs of cigarettes, y'all, in one fruity candy flavored device. It's just crazy. They're now synthesizing this nicotine in a lab. It is not being extracted from tobacco the way it was originally, and they're making it more and more addictive because, of course, that is the agenda. And believe it or not, despite all of the devices that you will see in the gas stations and the vape shops, that only 4 of those companies and 39 of those products are legal, because in the United States of America, the FDA has authorized only tobacco and menthol flavored disposable vapes and pods, believe it or not. But a state has to put teeth in it in order for that to stick. And Connecticut is not one of the states that has decided to, enforce the federal law. There's no long-term research. That's really the bottom line to tell kids, is that it took decades before we knew what cigarettes did, right? Doctors handed them out in the beginning. So that we do not know. We are just starting to see the damages that vaping is causing, but we don't know what inhaling these chemicals that are kind of a mystery are going to do long term. But we know that in some combination, there's at least 30 chemicals that can be in these devices that are known carcinogens, known respiratory irritants. And while cigarettes still have 200, cancer-causing chemicals, we know that there's something different about the way that this is landing in lungs. So it's actually not vapor. It is an aerosol. So when the heating element heats up that liquid, it actually it evaporates particles that end up sticking to things. So if you ever run in the car of somebody that vapes, it's like there's like a film on everything. So that e-sludge, as they call it, is what's is getting into lungs and throats. So what we're seeing is people getting sicker faster. And there are, you can look up those stories. I'm actually going to give you in your resources a whole list of stories you can use with kids of things that are going horribly wrong, including lung transplants, including kids. We had a kid die, Solomon Wynn, in my state a couple years ago, who was a healthy athlete just from vaping for 2 years. And we do know that a third of student users, and in Connecticut data, and we're waiting on the 2025 data, but the 2023 still tells us that about a third of student users in Connecticut are using daily. So that speaks to the addictiveness of it. There's no other drug that that kids are using with that frequency. So these are just some examples of some of the stealth, sneaky, evil, I will say, devices that exist, right? Some of them that can be refilled with THC liquid as well. So obviously, these are being made for young people to get by all of us adults who care about and are trying to protect them. And then this is where I start to get really agitated, because this is the newest wave of devices, is that they're gamified, they're technologically flashy, they're clearly being made and marketed, made for and marketed to kids. So they can play music, pair with your phone, that little round one is a Bluetooth speaker, play games like Pac-Man and Tetris, a couple of there's a one with a digital pet, Tamagotchi, that you keep. Guess how you keep your pet alive? Yep, you got to hit your vape, and there's a puff count competition. So you get a point for every time you hit your vape, and then you get to redeem your points for swag. Chris Brown's got a collector's card audition, and then edition, and then this is the one that I was telling you about, the 100,000 hit one. Doesn't look any different than these other ones necessarily, and that is $18, y'all. Online, and kids can buy these things, easily enough online. So just put it together, right? More appealing, plus more accessible, plus stronger, plus easier to conceal. It makes it more addictive and more dangerous for them, unfortunately. And we do see the good news is that national data is showing that the number of kids vaping is declining when they're less accessible in particular. So there is encouragement to be advocating for Connecticut to back up federal law, like some of the other states are doing. The American Lung Association they gave grades to all of the states based upon the money they were putting into programming and how much the environmental programs are trying to block access, and that Connecticut got an F. So we are, we need to be advocating and be applying this stuff with some fight behind it. So to understand why some kids are attracted to and attached to vaping, we need to understand the culture that exists around it. So I'm working with a lot of teens that are vaping that say, I can come off the nicotine, but I do like really dope vape tricks. I don't want everybody knows me for doing this. So go on YouTube, look up V-Gods. I'm telling you, this stuff is mad cool. It's very attractive. And there's whole communities around vaping. There's a connoisseurship, like I know all the flavors, I know all the different kinds. It can become like a hobby, right? And have all of these, like I said, community, VapeLife, Vape Nation. You can look it up. I know it'll screw up your algorithm, but you should see mine. So we know that about a third, I'm mentioning Zins because it's hard to extricate this from vaping, because we have about a third of students that are using tobacco are using 2 or more types of tobacco. And even though vape, like the nicotine's not coming from tobacco anymore, it's still being called a tobacco product. But the nicotine pouches, kids will be using these just to manage during the day when they are vaping, just so that they can get by school officials and parents until they can hit their vape again. But again, some of them are using it thinking that they're coming off of vaping, and that's not proving to be particularly effective. And we're seeing it being potentially an on-ramp. That's the thing I'm worried about. So nicotine pouches look like they're little dissolvable nicotine that goes, between the lip and the gum. And there's some, names for it, like cushies and pillows and upper and lower decky, and all this language that comes from TikTok, who really, really has pushed these products forward. And they can be from 1 to 30 cigarettes worth of nicotine in one of these one of these little pouches. And unlike chewing tobacco, you just toss the little pouch and it dissolves over about a half an hour. Can be really heavy duty nicotine that absorbs straight into the bloodstream. But kids are misperceiving these as harmless and even beneficial because they're being marketed as helping with focus and attention and energy. And again, all over, there's a whole language and culture that is being created by these companies, and the same tactics that vaping used, unfortunately. But they're going up in flavors. They're advancing the flavors and in the strength. So they're not trying to help people get off anything with those. And all of these, we know that about half of teens using tobacco in Connecticut, by our data, attempted to quit in the last year, which is a hopeful sign, right? So we really want to we really want to give them the resources to do that with, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So there are apps that kids, and you can even just put flyers around, as well as hand these resources to a kid that is interested in quitting. But there are real people and cheerleading and tips, and there can be a lot of great support in some of these apps. And they also, even though they are designed for nicotine, I've found kids coming off of THC because they don't have apps designed to help kids come off THC, is that they've used those effectively for THC as well. So, all right, let's talk about the weed, y'all. So we know that delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, right? The cannabinoid within the cannabis plant that is psychoactive and creates the high experience, that there is 0.5 to 1% THC in the plant cannabis originally. And now it has been modified where 20 is kind of low end average, and it can go up into the 30s now. And that's the plant. So when a kid says like, oh, it's natural and God put it here, no, babe, this is not natural anymore. And when they are vaping, it's not even marijuana anymore. So they're chemically extracting the THC, and it's important to note that it's also in the plant. There's a bunch of cannabinoids that balance each other out. So the CBD and some other chemicals in there kind of kept people from basically getting crazy and sick, for a long time, right? That wasn't something we heard about. And now they've modified the plant so that the THC is out of balance with the other cannabinoids, for one. But when you take just the THC out of the plant and then hulkify it, right? I mean, mutate it and then mix a bunch of other mystery crap in it, what you get is something that starts at 50% THC and goes into the 90s. And then the dab wax, the concentrates that are, honey, butter, so it can look like molasses or honey or wax or butter, and a little bit of this in another heating element, so like a pen or a vaping device, and it's heated up and vaporized. So, and they do have these rigs that look like bongs, and kids will use blow torches, when they're at home. I tell parents, like, if your kid's got a blowtorch, they're probably not making flambe in their room. But in our settings, we're most likely to, that kids are using these devices because they're super stealthy. And the dab can start at 70% THC. And so we're talking about a product that is 70 to 90%. I mean, 90 times stronger than the pot that we think about in the 70s. And then I just want to mention edibles. I know we're talking about vaping, but because again, kids that are vaping THC are often also getting into edibles, and they are getting increasingly easy to get, hands on. And even when it is a product that is labeled, which you have the advantage of being in a legal state, kids will still make these things and lace these things and not have any idea how much is in them. Or they have 4 gummy bears because, like, who has 1 gummy bear and walks away, right? And then that's way, way too much. So we have all these devices, again, really stealth ways that kids can use. And these candy carts, or cereal carts as they call them, for cartridges, these are straight up bootleg. None of these are being regulated in any way. If kids are seeing these, and obviously, who are they being made to be appealing to, right? Is it I went online to find pictures for these items, and I was told for 99 cents I could buy these empty cartridges and packaging. which means, and I ask kids this, what does that mean? That means they're being made in basements and garages. And these are the things that are most likely to be laced with the things I'm going to tell you about in a minute. So if you're not familiar with the language of a blinker is because these devices have heating elements, or a light that goes on to let you know that you're in danger of overheating the device. And so it is become a challenge to take a draw, to draw a big enough hit to make the blinking light go off, and called a blinker. Problem is that is about 8 to 10 seconds of a direct, strong hit to again, it is dangerous for an adolescent brain, and kind of an overdose risk to do that as well. And there's the companies making these devices have said, don't do this with our products. You are damaging it and literally releasing toxic chemicals into your bloodstream and to your brain. And these are just a bunch of terms that, as I talk to the youth, that they tell me are for THC and cannabis and using and dealers and being high. And I just bounced this off a college crowd the other day. That's like, oh yeah, you pretty much nailed it. So, and again, you're going to have the PDF of these if you want to look at them later. So THC use is the number one substance bringing teens and young adults into treatment right now. We've got a high rates of use disorders. This was fairly shocking data that just came out that 45% of 12 to 17-year-olds who say they've used in the past year meet the criteria for a cannabis use disorder. So again, this is speaking to how strong this is getting and how much it is hijacking kids quickly and creating problems for them. But THC use is historically high among college age students. Really need to stress that. Even though the data shows it might be either going down or staying the same for teenagers and not necessarily going up. What is going up is them vaping it. So the ones that are using more intense and more addictive substances, but our college students and young adults are really struggling increasingly with addiction. So we really need to make sure that we're educating our 12th graders about this. We know that kids who use before 18 are 4 to 7 times more likely to develop a cannabis use disorder. So this is a great stat to put out to encourage delaying use. But it's important to also note that this research was done with 8 to 10 or 5 to 10% THC, not 90%. And we're seeing withdrawal being extreme. And my friends working in treatment are watching the teenagers and young adults coming in who've been chronically using these heavy concentrates. Their withdrawal is looking the same as the kids coming off of Percocet and Oxycontin and heroin. Is that they're vomiting and stomach pains and sweating and chills and diarrhea and body temperature changes. So the conversation has shifted from the understanding that it's not physically addictive, it's only psychologically addictive, to the experts in the field saying it is becoming physically addictive. And it is no longer, I talk to a lot of parents or kids that say like, well, at least they're not doing hard drugs. I'm not going to do any of those hard drugs. It's become a hard drug, y'all. So one of the things that is also the effect that THC has on the brain is affecting part of the brain in the amygdala where we experience awe and wonder in everyday things, right? So when it's overactivating that's why there's that hyper focus and that amazement with like, oh my gosh, I've watched the leaves fall from the tree, for 2 hours. That's because it's overactivating that part of the brain. When you do that, you see 2 things happening. One is depression, because the brain loses the ability to do it on its own, and boredom. Like, now I need to get high to enjoy things. So the mental health piece is a huge concern right now. This is what we're really seeing some explosions of incidences with, is that we know that a kid who is depressed or anxious is more likely to use and then more likely to develop a use disorder. And we see 3 times the rates of major depressive disorder in kids that are using regularly. So there's both a kind of a chicken and egg here, is that yes, we know that it's worsening depression that somebody already has, but they have done enough longitudinal studies now to show that it's causing depression with kids that didn't show any signs to start with. Suicidal thoughts are 5 times higher in kids that are using daily. So again, it's not necessarily causing it, but at least it is something. If a kid is coming to us with depression, with suicidal ideation, for us to make sure that we are checking on their asking them questions about their use. And then psychotic disorders. So we've known for a long time that if somebody has a predisposition to psychosis, to schizophrenia, to bipolar disorder, that using even the old school marijuana could trip those symptoms into, sparking them earlier, younger, worse, harder to treat. But what we're seeing is kids without predisposition now developing psychotic disorders. So there can be that one-time episode. We know a kid can have so much that they go into psychosis, but it's not just normal and harmless, like the kids will blow off. Is that one time of having a psychotic episode, they have a 47% higher chance of developing schizophrenia and bipolar. And a kid that's using regularly is 11 times as likely to develop that psychotic disorder. So I am unfortunately in communication with and part of networks of parents that there are hundreds and hundreds of them that are dealing with their kids being in active psychosis right now. So we know if it's stunting the front part of the brain, it is stunting the ability to manage emotions. And that is not just now, that means into adulthood. So as somebody who's worked with people in treatment that are 40, 50 years old that started using at 14, that they still are having like tantrums, adolescent tantrums. And amotivational syndrome is a thing, is that the THC is impacting some dopamine activity in the brain. So what happens at every age is they show that the more somebody uses, the less goal attainment they have, the less satisfaction they have with elements of their life. So this again can interweave with depression. And that it's a myth that it helps sleep. It's a myth. So while it may help a kid get to sleep, it interferes with them getting that deep REM sleep. So will still be tired, but I work with a lot of kids that say they're using because it helps them sleep. So that's important info to share. And while THC does not kill brain cells, I mean, again, this conversation is changing a little bit because we're watching it do something different. This mutated version of these high concentrates is that it's doing more damage than before. But even the old research, I mean, I've had a slide like this for 10 years saying that when kids are using and they're using heavily or using regularly, that there's impacts on memory, on learning, on big picture thinking, on all that frontal lobe activity, executive functioning. And the more that they use, the higher the dosage, the younger that they go there, the more likely are to experience all of this. But I will tell you, as somebody who is now friends with the people that are researching this, the stuff that's not Googleable yet, is that they've just started the research on what 50, 60, 90% THC is doing to a growing adolescent brain. And it is as terrifying as you would think. It's making some very big impacts, and it's not taking kids needing to use much. Rare use of these high concentrated products is proving to do some long-term damage. And it's important for a kid to know too that for an adult, so we use, and it sticks in our brain for about 24 hours. So even though we may only feel high for like 2 hours, our motor coordination, response time, our ability to take something we learn and put it into long-term memory, that is all affected for about 24 hours. For a kid who has more cannabinoid receptors in their brain, what that means is that it sticks longer. So a kid uses on a Friday, they're still not on point in all of these ways for that test on Monday. And that might actually matter, to a kid. I love these visuals. These come from the Amen Clinic, and they have these for a bunch of substances, is that they do all these brain scans on kids. And so this was showing the visual of, no, I have to explain to them, this doesn't mean it turns your brain into Swiss cheese. What it means is that they put electrodes on these kids that were using with this amount of regularity. And this is demonstrate, and then had them go through a bunch of tasks involving cognitive activity. And this shows where the oxygen is not going, and they are not they're not on point anymore in these parts of the brain. So, and that's what it should look like on the left. But adolescents, visuals can be really powerful. This helped my kid when he went into college and started to experiment with cannabis. He's like, Mom, you totally ruined this for me. Like I would use and I would picture those like purple Swiss cheese brains. It's like, yes, score, right? So that can be powerful. And you know, for the first time in history, we're seeing serious marijuana overdoses, typically from vaping high concentrates as well as from edibles. There's been an explosion of these from edibles, and kids refer to this as greening out. And this will look like dropping unconscious, dizzy, paranoia, psychosis, as I mentioned, just confusion, rapid heartbeat, you know, palpitations, and extreme and painful vomiting to the point that there is now a term called scromiting, a medical term where people are screaming and vomiting at the same time because of how much it hurts to do it. But this can create some long-term health problems. Is that kids, like I said, sleep can start to be really affected. But cannabinoid hyperemesis is a condition that's being caused. Again, kids, we have cannabinoid receptors in the gut. And so medicinal prescription with weaker marijuana was designed to help with nausea for a lot of folks, right? Nausea and vomiting, to suppress that for people that were taking medications or having conditions that cause that. But because it's become this mutated substance, that the brain and the body are, our brains and bodies aren't designed for what this has become, is that it's creating stomach conditions. So pain and nausea and trouble eating, like loss of appetite. And so I will again see kids that think that they are treating that by using. And then we see some long-term heart arrhythmias happening, and kids are more likely actually to have strokes when they are using cannabis. All of the hemp derivatives, it gets really confusing, but you know, the bottom line of what's happening here is that when the cannabis sativa plant has more than 0.3% THC, it's called marijuana, delta 9 THC. When it has less than 0.3%, it's called hemp, and it's been is federally legal until this coming November, when it is not going to be. But the point is that they have taken the, again, chemically extracted cannabinoids or alkaloids from the cannabis plant, the hemp plant, and then mutating the hell out of them and creating substances that can make people high. So in Connecticut, you got to be over 21, supposedly, only supposed to be in licensed dispensaries. You know, we know that isn't always the case, but so far what we're seeing, the preliminary research is showing similar effects in terms of brain development. We're seeing ER admissions exploding. We're also seeing use disorders blowing up from these things too, but there is minimal, typo there, minimal regulation and minimal research on this so far, lots of unknowns. So the other things that can be in vapes are that is LSD, heroin, GHB, ketamine, and PCP. GHB is a kind of a heavy duty sedative that can act like alcohol. It's just made in bathtubs, y'all. And then ketamine, PCP, which are heavy duty hallucinogens. Xylazine, also known as the zombie drug, is a tranquilizer that is getting in a lot of things because it extends the high of something, but also getting into vapes. And nitazines, I hate to tell you that there is something stronger than fentanyl, and it is another illicit opioid that can be 10 to 50 times stronger than fentanyl, and it is getting into vapes. So I didn't say fentanyl on here. Let me say fentanyl. Fentanyl can be in vapes as well. The tricky thing with this is that it's not vapes. Typical vapes are not heated up enough to activate fentanyl. But what we're seeing is, because it's so incredibly strong, is it can just be, and doesn't need to be activated to evaporate and to hurt or kill a kid. Now that there's multiple notable Connecticut cases of kids dying and nearly dying from laced vapes. There's one in Bloomfield just a couple years ago. All right. Take the deep breath. So that is the stressful, dooming feeling stuff. But I want to talk about what we do about it now. Very, very important that we dive into this. So let's talk about the prevention, our prevention approaches first. So, who is at risk of vaping and using THC and nicotine? Who do you guess? Yes, it is all of them. I can hear you. So, in the words of Frances Jensen, she wrote a book called The Teenage Brain that's awesome. But she referred to teenage brains as, jacked up stimulus-seeking brains that are not yet capable of making mature decisions. So, because of adolescent brains, they are all at risk. So I want to do a little bit of Brain 101. And I know a lot of you know a lot about this, but just to superimpose this onto the vaping and substance use discussion, is that we know that, the brain is not done growing until mid to late 20s. They've just a few weeks ago said it looks like they're actually extra malleable until about 30 now. But so that prefrontal cortex, right? The brain grows bottom to top, back to front, thinking brain going last, and the prefrontal cortex the last thing to go. That's where big picture thinking is. So the ability to think about, like, what could happen if I make this choice? How could this affect other people? Is this a good idea, bad idea? What are the pros and the cons, right? All of that's in the front part of the brain. So if I want to get from point A to point B, how do I get there? Sort of our planning and emotional management and impulse control, all of that. So when a kid is at 14, freshman year, they still have 30%, about a third of their brain, that part of the brain left to grow. And by 18, there's still about 20% of it left to grow. So that's why they think they're all grown, and we're like, oh, honeys, that's so cute. So this leads to, believe it or not, hyper rational thinking. And I know you that are in the room here that are parents that have had or have adolescents, you're like, what are you talking about? How can they be hyper rational? But what that means is that they will look at the likelihood of a consequence happening kind of over the weight of that consequence. So is it more likely that I get busted and have that crap I don't want, or that it brings me something I want, like acceptance and cool points and taking away my stress and good feelings? And they will steer towards, what it is likely to bring them. So Dan Siegel, if you're familiar with him, he's a child development expert, calls it Russian roulette thinking. That's a very, very fitting name. So what fires wires for our adolescents? So that means because their brains are super malleable, I tell them they're like that model magic clay that's super shapeable, and then it hardens, right? And it's way harder to re-moisten and shape that again, is that everything they do, that they are watching, listening to, doing with their body, thinking even, right? That they do something that fires the synapses right between their brain cells, and those brain cells wire together. They have more brain cells than they're ever going to have in 5th and 6th grade. But what they don't have is connection. So everything they're doing, cha-chonk, hardwires a connection, especially if they repeat that thing into adulthood. Now, this is where dopamine comes in. So dopamine, which is the reward and motivation chemical in the brain, when we do something that our brain registers as like, oh, this helps your survival. Yeah, do that again. I like that. So if something brings a kid feelings that they like or take away ones that they don't, then the dopamine pops off. And important to note that they have a dip in dopamine during adolescence. So they're walking around craving novel, new, exciting dopamine popping experiences. It works. They do something that pops off the dopamine, and then there goes the cha-chonk. Then it hardwires. And their dopamine, when it does pops off extra, extra big. So their feel goods feel extra good, and their feel bads feel extra bad. Is that their amygdalas, right? That threat alarm that they have, is overreactive. So it over perceives things as threats, and their stress hormones are popping off extra, and their reproductive hormones have them on a ride, right? Like, I want to punch people, and now I can't stop crying and make it stop. So they have a lot to want to escape and numb out and turn down, and they do something that works. So if it is vaping that seems to be a shortcut to getting what they want and escaping the things that they don't, that can wire for them. So the bad news is that they're wired for habit forming and addiction like no other time. But it's also the good news, because this means with prevention, we have this ripe opportunity to help them have alternatives, right? To wire ways of meeting the needs that vaping can before they even get their hands on it, and to get them messages that really stick for them, habits that really stick for them. And the good news is also that even if they're starting to go there, their brains are still ripe enough for us to redirect them, right? So we do have higher risk kids. So we know that kids who are experiencing chronic little traumas, right, chronic stress, or have had big traumatic incidences are way more likely to use all substances. But we see this with vaping as well. So a kid with four or more ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, if you're not familiar, definitely look that up. But four or more, a kid is 4 to 12 times more likely to develop a substance use disorder when they are growing up with substance use or problems or any addiction in the family. We know that there can be both the environment, right, that they have more exposure to, more access to, it's being modeled, right, and that again is wiring for them. But we also know that genetic predisposition is very real, and that it's not necessarily just substance specific. So yes, a kid can inherit their response to a substance, so to nicotine or to cannabis. If everybody up their family tree has also had a positive experience, they could have one as well. But it can be that what's happening is that what they're inheriting is a deficit in dopamine or serotonin or oxytocin, which is the connection drug, or something that that everybody in the family tree has just been looking for a way to amp up and normalize, their brain chemistry. So that's why, dad had an issue with porn, and mom shops too much, and grandpa gambled, and the aunt had an issue with cocaine, and this kid is more likely to have a problem with nicotine or with THC. We do know it is important to know too that sibling use can be even more powerful than parent use in terms of influence. Is that if a kid perceives their older sibling using THC, they're 6 times more likely to go there. If that older sibling initiates use with them or uses with them, they are almost guaranteed to develop a cannabis use disorder. And that goes with all the substances, unfortunately. We know that our kids that are plugged in to screens and have more social media and screen time are more likely to be going there. Kids that have challenges making friends, keeping friends, they've got some discomfort socially. They're more likely to sort of fall into peer pressure and do things to be accepted. But also, if it helps them feel comfortable in their skin, which was my case with alcohol. I was in rehab at 19 with full blown alcoholism and an eating disorder, and because food and booze really helped me, well, booze in particular helped me feel better socially. I'll talk more about that too. Kids with mental health issues, as I mentioned, right, they're more likely to use and develop a problem, especially if it works to help them feel better. We know that kids with impulsivity and compulsivity, I put a star by this, is a really strong indicator of future addictive behaviors of all kinds, and particularly substance use. So this is a sweet spot, honestly, for us to know that we can catch a kid in kindergarten and really help redirect them away from this stuff if we, intervene and wrap around. So our kids with learning challenges and neurodiversity are more at risk. Our ADHD kids, I see a lot of them that are self-medicating with nicotine, self-medicating with THC because it creates a hyper focus, and they believe that it's helping. They don't know that it's doing that damage behind the scenes, which is going to be important to teach them. But this could be also part of processing. If processing is slower for these kids, if they feel like an oddling and they're kind of overcompensating by really wanting to belong, right? All of them puts them at more risk. But our kids with high IQ, hate the term gifted, our high IQ kids are also at risk. And we tend to miss that population because they really think they can outwit substance use. They're not going to become addicted. They're not going to use that way, right? Kids with failing grades, are LGBTQ plus kids. And we see this in Connecticut. The data really backs this as well, is that we see the Connecticut Youth Risk Behavior Survey data showing us that our queer identifying kids are using earlier and more. Native American multiracial kids also tend to go there younger. And early puberty, when a kid hits, their body develops, they tend to be attracted to more kind of grown up or adult people and content and behaviors. And I love, talking with parents about this, as I did the other night. But we know that both parents that are like free range, don't have a lot of expectations and guidelines. Like I don't want to squash my kids' spirits, so I'm just going to let them out there, and life will teach them all the lessons, right? And there's less supervision and monitoring and guidance that they're more likely to use and use younger. But the authoritarian parents too, the ones that are controlling and telling kids who to be and what to do and what to think, and you know, all up in their grill, those kids end up going there, particularly once they leave their watch. If anybody knows any of those preacher kids that just went buck wild as soon as they hit college. So neither of those styles help a kid develop an inner compass. So it's helpful for us to know who those kids are so that we can be thinking as early as possible about how do we particularly get programming and messages to these kids to help prevent them going there. So, addiction starts because something works or gives us feelings that we like, or kids use because they believe it's going to do one of these things for them. So they've got these 6 psychosocial needs. And this is going to help with both prevention and with intervention. So one is that dopamine, right? They're craving those kind of healthy, scary experiences. Like, oh my gosh, can I get on stage and like give that presentation or do that dance or climb that climbing wall? Oh my God, I did it, and all the dopamine pops, right? They need that. They want to belong like no other time. They have felt controlled their whole lives. They really want to have a sense of freedom and feel some choices over their lives as they move into adolescence. They're trying to figure out who they are and feel like they've got a sense of value and worth and then like that person and feel like they're good at something. And they don't want to feel distressed. And thanks to the whole other presentation, y'all, but these things, the devices and their screen time, and how parenting styles have changed, we actually have a generation of kids that is particularly intolerant of distress, if you haven't noticed, but they really don't want to feel stress and discomfort. So the elevator speech version of how to keep our kids from going there or redirect them if they are, is that we need to look at how can we on our watch, whether it is an after school program or we're a clinician or we're in a school, what can we do to help our kids meet these needs in satisfying ways, like ways that they can access and that work for them? Because the bottom line is that they are going to, I grew up over a bar and a restaurant. So when I was, trying to fill these needs for myself, I had food and I had booze. And there I was in rehab at 19, right, with full-blown addictions. So we want to, vaping can fill every single one of these. So what else can we point them towards, engage them in, help families provide their kids with and resource them? So this is, I'm giving you this worksheet. I am, as I mentioned in the beginning, I've got a bunch of a whole toolkit resource vortex that I'm going to be sending you to at the end. But I do have this worksheet, and I use this. We can use this for prevention, and use this to give to families to talk about this. And we're going to talk later about how to use it for intervention. But so having any kind of activity, any conversation where we can say, okay, so why do kids vape? And they will come up with these 6 reasons, I guarantee you. Then we can say, okay, well, how does vaping then backfire for people? How do you see that turning against them? And because we want them to be looking at how, a kid will use to be accepted. Like a kid will use because they're feeling stressed and to escape, and how much that can actually backfire, right? It starts to turn against and create the opposite of that. We want to highlight that that's what use eventually does, right? And then asking them like, so what ways do you have of meeting these needs for yourself? What do you need more of so that none of these addictive things, end up being appealing for them? Because the thing is, if they've got a hole in any of those areas, anything that works is going to get attached to. And so it could be, gambling or food or boys or, right? So then we engage them in like, what do you still need? How can I support you in that? And I've got a whole lesson plan for doing this. Also, talking about risk and protective factors before they start using can be a really powerful conversation. So helping, and these are two ways that I created to do that. The one on the right I use for is kind of more simplified. The one on the left is for older kids to be able to talk about how addiction is a biopsychosocial thing, right? And so analyzing, looking at what their risk factors are that they have and what their protective factors are. With this figure, I have them write their inner risk and protective factors on the inside and their outer ones on the outside. But a good way to go in on this, I didn't list this here, but if anybody's familiar with the natural high videos, they are awesome for our middle schoolers in particular, is in, I would say 5th grade through 8th grade, is that there's all these role model types. There are musicians and athletes and influencers talking about their life stories, and they highlight some of their risk factors and the protective factors or natural highs that they have. So I will use those videos and have kids kind of to Trojan horse in to sneak in them doing some self-reflection, is having them say, okay, well, what did you see in this person's story, and fill out these charts. And now let's talk about you. What do you have going on for you? What do you need to build up so that you are more resilient to, and you're going to be resistant to all of this addictive stuff pushing and pulling on you. So the 40 developmental assets is another thing that is helpful, that a kid, again, with an activity, they can be looking at those and sort of checking off the ones that they have. And I have a risk and protective factors checklist that I created for substance use. And all of that, again, is in your toolkit. So we want to explore values and goals. So this is, I think, one of the most powerful things that we can do preventatively, but we're also going to talk how to use this with intervention. But however we ask these questions, is we want to ask, like, so how could vaping conflict with who you believe in being and what you want for yourself? Because we know that we try as adults to kind of impose our values and tell them all the ways that it can be bad for them, but we need it to stick for them in the ways that matter to them. So we ask them this, and we ask them, so and what are your lines that you refuse to cross? What are your guidelines for yourself around vaping, and other substance use? And what relationship do you want to have and not have with vaping, and other substances, not just now, but forevermore, as you're an adult looking forward. And then how are you going to stick to these commitments? And then how can I help you? Again, in whatever role we're playing, what can I do to help you stick with these? So I've got some activities that you could use to have these conversations. I created this values rating scale, and this is where, and I use this all the way from 7th grade into adults, actually, is have them rating these values. And there's about 30 of them, I think, on there, from spirituality to acceptance to appearance to being a leader, family, etc. So they rate them from 1 to 5, and then drop the 5s into the second worksheet and spark this conversation about, how could vaping or substance use interfere with this thing that is really important to you. And I actually have a whole bundle of activities that they're on my website. They're on Teachers Pay Teachers, if any of my educators in the room, for like $3 or something, I think. But it's a whole bunch of like fun, interactive ways to have these discussions about values and help kids get clear on those. But again, the main question, how could this conflict with who you believe in being and what you want for yourself? So for those of you working in schools, but this doesn't just have to be schools, it's that there's some curriculum out there, curricula that is totally free, that is really easy to use. And catch my breath, Eberfi have them, but I can't stress enough the value of the Stanford curriculum. So they have tobacco, they have vaping, and they have THC as well. The beautiful thing about this is that it's on Canva, it's constantly updated. You can grab one slide from this to use for whatever your purpose is. Even if you're leading a counseling group, you can pull materials from this curriculum. And they've got queer specific curriculum. They're actually continuing to develop new things every day. That's awesome. Like I said, they have a cannabis one. Johnny's Ambassadors has also free gamified curriculum that can be, particularly with middle schoolers, it can be catching or engaging for them. And Safety First is my favorite. I'll just highlight that. For full drug curricula, that again, you can use pieces of And I want to stress the value of peer education, of peer-led programming. And again, this is even whether you're directing a camp or an after-school program, is when kids are hearing the messages from others that they respect, from older ones, from cool kids, it is way more impactful than it is no matter how cool we think we are. So this looks like, them designing these messages, them being the ones to deliver them. And using social norming is also very powerful. So what this is basically flipping the script on, instead of focusing on, oh my gosh, here's how many kids are doing this and this is awful. We want to be focusing on how many kids aren't, because the adolescent brain perceives that more kids are vaping than are. We know this. The data proves this over and over again at every age. They think that the older kids are using more and that even their same age peers. So we want to be highlighting how much it's really not happening. That, this is just some examples that from your data, like grab that Connecticut data, as local as you can get the better, but mentioning how, focusing on how abstinence of all substances, but vaping is actually, like, not vaping is trending. Less and less kids are starting to do it. Way more kids are not than are. And that a good proportion of kids that are vaping want to quit. They're trying to quit. They did not mean to get addicted. And if you can use a kid that's been there and done that and come off of it, that's been proven to be one of the most popular, or one of the most impactful things. Curricular infusion, I say that even if you're not working in a school and you're working in a bigger program of some kind. What I mean by that is that it's not just like you're the drug lady and you come in and you teach the drug lesson and it's drug ed time, or vaping education time. Is that we want this to be woven in so kids can't escape it. Like, it is, everybody is talking about it in the school. So if you're in a school, that means that not only is it like slapped on the walls and on the bulletin boards and in the bathrooms, but that the social studies teacher is, having debates about legalization, that the language arts teacher is assigning papers about it, the science teacher is talking about adolescent brains, the coach, but in to start off every practice says, hey, let's talk about like ways that we respect our body and make sure we can stay good athletes, and how could vaping interfere with that? Or let's talk about how we take care of each other like a team. Are we going to do things to each other and encourage each other to do things that could hurt each other? And what does that have to do with like peer pressure and vaping and substance use? That's been proven again to sometimes be more impactful than it is when we just teach the drug ed lesson. Modeling, I cannot stress enough how powerful our modeling is. So yes, this means we have to be conscientious of how we talk about and what we represent in terms of how we use substances. So in terms of vaping, there are students that have caught their teachers vaping in corners, or they've seen a teacher have a vape in their car, or they've seen them out in public vaping. Is it that can really do some damage, honestly, on their own attitudes. It impacts their attitudes. So think about how we can highlight also how it impacts them when we talk about how much natural highs we have, how we have great friendships and crazy fun, and be that person that is an example of a fulfilling life without using any substances, and sort of highlighting that, because that soaks in too. And our attitudes matter when we just make sure to drop. We hope that because I care about you, I hope that you won't be doing these things because I want to be protecting your brain. So, but let's be honest, is that, and this will be valuable for the parents in the room as well, is that it can be challenging to get through to teenagers, whether it is one-on-one or it is in a class environment, like speaking about this stuff in ways that they actually are impacted by. So whether it's prevention or intervention, I want to teach you some teen communication Jedi tips that are just going to be valuable in any setting. So for one, we want to honor their intelligence. And I taught this to the parents too, if you watched the parent webinar from the other night. Is what this looks like is, before we teach them anything, before we launch into what we know and want them to know, we ask, so what do you know about vaping THC, like concentrates compared to compared to the plant? What do you know about the plant now compared to the 70s, right? We would ask them what they know first, because what they are used to us doing is completely is kind of disempowering and invalidating, their knowledge that they already have. And that's really feels condescending and insulting to them. So ask them what they know first. And then before we like engage them in problem solving, saying like, here's how to get through peer pressure, for example, right? Or here's an idea I have for you. We just ask. So don't inflict help. I love that phrase. I heard from another therapist, is because they expect us to be intrusive. We just are as grown-ups. So we ask them like, hey, are you open to brainstorming some ideas about how to get through, the peer pressure you're experiencing? Or, I experienced something like that, or I still experience peer pressure. Are you open to hearing what I do and what that's looked like for me? So just remember, they're not going to give you a yes until they know that you respect their no's. And reflect on that statement. I have to say that a lot. So honor their autonomy. What that means is this is motivational interviewing 101, MI 101, is that we just dropping that like, hey, only you can decide what to do with this information, or it's your life, right? Only you can choose what to do with this here. I'm not telling you what to do, just giving you some info, to make some choices with. And that's actually really goes far in terms of earning respect. We want to make sure that they expect judgment and lectures from and invalidation from adults. They just do. So we want to respect their viewpoint, even if it's, quote unquote, wrong or unhealthy. We can still put ourselves in their place with the way that their brains work, what they are exposed to, the messages, that we can understand why they think and feel the way that we do, the way that they do. If they're making the choice to use, we can say, we say first, hey, it sounds like you got a lot of good reasons to want to block out your thoughts at night, right? It sounds like you got it makes sense that you are using, because of your stress with your parents divorcing right now, right? I can understand why you'd want to do that. So we do that first. And then they're more likely to respect any direction we lead them in next. And then we got to check our reactivity and detach from outcomes. And it's hard when we care about them. And I definitely say this to parents, but we're kind of helping raise these kids sometimes, right? I had kids from 5th grade through 8th grade. I was like co-parenting them. I fell in love with these kids. So when they came to me saying that they were doing these risky things, it was really hard for me not to just go, okay, tell me more about that, to use these skills. So just remember that if reactivity will lose their trust. And we have to detach. If we're working in a clinical setting or school counseling, we can't attach to what they're going to do, with this information. We want to keep our big old butts out. That means that if we do a good job of validating, like I can understand why you would do that, why you would be doing this. I can see why you would feel that way. If we then say, but we invalidate the whole first part of their sentence. And again, adults do this all the time. So we want to add an and, like I can hear how weed is helping you sleep. And I just got some, new research I wanted to share with you if you're open to it, right? This is huge, that we have a tendency to impose our values and our shoulds on kids. They're used to it all the time. So we want to speak to their values and realities. If we're going to get them, as I spoke about before with values, if it's going to matter to them, we got to speak to the things that matter to them, right? So if they care about college and being a good spouse someday, or being a parent, like, okay, go there, or the career, their career choice in the future, but we need to speak to the things that matter to them, like maybe it is their reputation, or their skin, or their athleticism, or their cognitive skills, or getting good sleep. Like that's what we speak to. And yes, disclosing your own experience can be very, very powerful, very impactful. I do it all the time, and I'm told that it works. But we have to be really conscientious about it, right? We got to be really clear on those boundaries. Like, why are we disclosing this information? Is it to be funny and entertain and get cool points from them? Because that's not the right reason. Or is it to help them delay use, or redirect and change, or want something different? Yes, that's a good reason to you to disclose. So we got to remember how the adolescent brain hears things. That if there's the slightest hint that of something that they're going to take in as like, oh, well, that sounds really fun and adventurous and like stories to tell forevermore, right? The broken leg sounds like it's worth it if you've got this like wild dopamine popping story, right? They hear the dopamine, so we want to make sure that we are not romanticizing it in any way, even subtly. All right, intervention. So we're going to apply some of these things specifically to stepping in with a kiddo. And I'm not going to get too much into the clinical details, but the cycle of change is a good framework to be, I think, working through to have. And if you're not familiar with this, definitely look it up. But this is by Prochaska and DiClemente, and this is 40 or I think 40 years old. But it basically talks about the change process that anybody goes through, going from the first stage of I don't have a problem and I don't want to change use to when they actually implement that. So keeping in mind that when a kid comes to us, right, or they're brought to us using substances, that knowing what stage they're in really helps us decide how we can be most helpful to nudge them towards wanting to change and actually having some tools and some skills to do that with. So yes, initially there some kids that they're dragged to us, they're in that pre-contemplative stage. They're like, I don't have a problem. The only problem that I have is that other people have a problem with this, that I'm not supposed to be doing it at school, or that my parents are so strict about it, right? And then we've got contemplation. So this is a really rich moment when a kid is like, okay, I realize that it's doing some things I don't like. It's working against me, but it's ambivalence, right? But it's still doing some things I like, right? I still like some things about it. And these are the two, these first two stages are when motivational interviewing skills are really going to be the most valuable. And then when a kid is like, okay, I get it. I really do want to change, but how? Right. And this is when we're going to be helping them get kind of like the hope, the skills, the knowledge, the resources to move them into action. So here's the early intervention recipe, and I'm gonna do the overview and then deep dive as best as I can with the time we've got left. So it can be impactful, for kids to learn the research-based facts about the risks of vaping, in and of itself. That this can often move kids into wanting to make a change, right? If we do this well, it can jolt them into realizing they don't want to do it anymore. So we also want to educate them on what constitutes problem use, what that line is between I'm just experimenting or I'm just using for fun, or this is just like, recreational use, and then what a use disorder is and where they are on that continuum. So again, I'm going to give you all the ways to do this. And then again, we want to bring those values out. We want to get them to get that this is working against who they believe in being and what they want for themselves. And then we need to help them identify why they're using. What needs are they trying to meet of those 6 needs that I put out there, and then what do we need to help them, develop and strengthen and access to replace them, to have healthy alternatives. And then they need to know like real world skills, real strategies for how do they resist and navigate through their external pressures to use, which are coming from, peers and media and their community and their family in a lot of cases. And then we want to be catalysts for collaborative wraparound support that includes partnership with between parents and school and mental health and medical providers and community organizations, right? And wherever we're positioned, how can we really try to weave together as much wraparound as we can? And if this is on campus, this means all departments, all staff, right, are aware of the part that they can play. Because sometimes it is the custodian that catches the kid vaping. It is the bus driver where the kids are getting on and they're all lighting up, they're lighting their vapes up. They need to know how they could do something to make a difference too. And then wrapped around this is our relationship to them, is that us having a rapport of trust and respect, because if they're going to see us as reliable sources of info and guidance and support, then and follow our lead, then they have to respect us, which happens when they feel respected by us. So we talked a lot about how to do the educational pieces, but I want to talk a little bit more about some teaching tips, kind of about how to deliver that psychoeducation in ways that they will hear. For one, is that we adults with good intentions, right? We have tended to focus on all the ways that drugs can damage the body after years of chronic use, right? Again, that tar-covered lung in the jar. But what no kid ever thinks that they're going to be that person. That's not the plan. They're just doing this for now. So remember that teens are going to naturally focus more on the short-term reward over the long-term risk. So we want to focus on those long-term risks that matter to them, but we really want to be stressing the more immediate and likely things that they already experience, like having trouble, running on the soccer field, right? Their ability, their memory, their ability to learn, their mood, the effect on their esteem, etc. We got to be accurate. We can't just grab the headline and grab the statistic and then, throw it out as gospel, because they can Google faster than us and use AI better already. So all it takes is one inaccurate fact to totally lose them, right? To lose their trust. So it is okay. And it's actually a beautiful moment when we can say, I don't know that. This is actually changing constantly. Let's look it up together, because then you get to sort of model seeking truth, for one, and reliable sources of info. We want for them to learn the adolescent brain science that we just went through a minute ago, and the science of addiction can be really powerful. So for them to understand that it doesn't matter how smart they are, doesn't matter how much willpower they have, that this is just science, that these substances hijack the brain, right? That it takes over, especially if they've got genetic risk. So we want to talk to them about the impact that family history can have on them, so that they will have some ability to kind of see it and overpower it. And yes, we want to use examples of kids like them that have had the horrible things happen. And again, I'm giving you a list of some of those stories to use. They need to see that it can happen to them. But we got to go past the scare tactics. We can't, otherwise that gets dismissed as over dramatic. If anybody remembers like the Just Say No campaigns and the This Is Your Brain on Drugs campaign, that was hella dramatic. The frying pan with the egg and trashing the room. And for a lot of us, we just laughed at that, right? We're like, that's hella dramatic, right? And then threw out the whole message. So again, we want to make sure that we are teaching more relevant stuff as well, and everyday relevance. Harm reduction approach. We got to take this, especially with our kids that are using, but even as a prevention strategy, we know that when we are doing programming for the whole campus, we want to make sure that we are not just speaking to the kids that will never think about going there, but we've got to be speaking to the kids that are already curious, or the ones that are already going there as well, and weaving in information, especially when we're behind closed doors and we're in a counseling setting. We can definitely have those conversations, which look like, okay, if you're hell bent on going there, right? How are you not going to hurt yourself or somebody else? What do you know about safer or minimizing risk of using these things? We want to encourage trusted sources of information, right? For them to be critical of the messages they're getting, but the sources of that information. So thinking about, to question the agendas, right? And the expertise of what they're hearing. Like, who was studied in that? They're Googling and they come up with, no, this helps with mental health. Weed helps with bipolar disorder and with mood disorder, and they're using all these other drugs for therapy. Okay, so who did they study? Is that adults or is that kids? Is that kids like you, kids with ADHD, kids that are adopted, kids that are Black, etc.? Was that 5% THC or 90% that they did that research with? So teach them to be super analytical. And we need to be able to acknowledge, like, name all the complexities and the hypocrisies around this. It is complex, right? I mean, the fact that alcohol and tobacco are legal nationally, right? As super toxic substances that kill the most people, really. But marijuana isn't legal everywhere, or that yes, people are managing their bipolar disorder effectively with marijuana, and then we see people causing it or worsening it. So what's the difference there, right? it's their age and it's the strength, but we want to be able to, again, not just dismiss that. And then, it is one of the most powerful things is kind of flipping over, not just saying like, oh, here's all the bad things that can happen if you use, but really highlighting, like I mentioned before with modeling, like the advantages of not using and delaying use. Like if you let your brain grow all the way, if you develop all of these coping tools before you even consider adding these substances, then you will be able to handle anything, right? If you make sure that your friends, if you develop friendships based on like your connection before you bring a substance in, then they're real friendships, right? So that can be, I think, really, really powerful. So educating on problem use. I like this 4 C's of addiction. I think this is a really digestible thing for a kid to just take the criteria for a use disorder and make it, digestible for them. Is that first I just say like, hey, if it's creating problems for you in any place of your life, then it's problem use, right? Then it's no longer responsible and healthy use. But we start using the A word or use disorder when it's creating problems for you and you're taking some risks that could hurt yourself or somebody else with the way that you use, but you keep on doing it anyway, even though you don't like what it's creating. When there's a loss of control. So when you're trying to set limits for yourself and you can't stick to them, or you can't predict who you become or what choices you make, when you start to use. You say you're not going to use at school. You say you're only going to hit it once. You say you're only going to use on weekends. But here you are, using, way more than that. Or that you said it would make you funnier, but now it's really making you paranoid and anxious. You can't control the effect it's having on you. When a kid starts to orbit more and more around of their life around use, it's taking up increasing amount of time and thoughts and emotions and, planning it, like thinking about it, planning it, doing it, recovering from it, cleaning up, the consequences from it, feeling bad about it, etc. This also includes like when they are kind of worshiping it, when kids are following accounts that have to do with nicotine, with vaping and nicotine and THC. And then there's, that difference between when, sometimes they are seeing adults manage their stress, after a hard day of work, hitting their THC vape, right? Or their nicotine vape. And so stressing kind of that difference between when it is a tool in the toolbox, and this applies, by the way, to all potentially addictive behavior, when it's a tool in the toolbox versus the tool, right? It's the thing that they have, that they go to cope with their uncomfortable feelings, right? Or when they, when they're angry, when they're stressed, when they feel insecure, etc. And then there's tolerance and withdrawal, right? And we know that both of those, as we mentioned, both of those products, both THC and nicotine, come with physiological tolerance and withdrawal, right? As well as emotional, is that they need more and more of it. They need to use it more often to get the same high because the brain is getting desensitized, right? To those chemicals being overactivated, or when they take it away or it wears off, they kind of go into some shock, or they feel, because the brain chemicals are crashing, they're destabilized, right? The body's in some shock because it doesn't have the substances in it anymore. And talking with them, by the way, about what withdrawal symptoms is also a great preventative strategy as well. So I created this self-assessment to use for all the addictive behaviors. So, from sports betting to self-harm to substance use. And in a setting, and this is tricky. So again, I was a school counselor for 23 years. And even though I was a clinician outside of there, I couldn't be a therapist inside. So I couldn't do formal assessments or diagnose, a kid in a school setting, but they can diagnose themselves, and they love to, thanks to TikTok, right? So they all think they have dissociative identity disorder. I'm like, baby, this is just, you are an adolescent. You have 100 different parts to you, right? So they ask themselves these 11 questions. And you can use that to spark some conversation about, to kind of deep dive a little bit more into how it's affecting them, but then give them, so, this is what this says, is that 2 to 3 is a mild disorder. If you have 2 or 3 yeses, 4 to 5 is moderate, 6+ is severe. So says this, this thing I'm letting you read. So what do you think about that? How does that land for you to have that say that this is severe, right? And this can really again spark some rich conversation about what, if anything, it inspires them to want to change. So this looks more complicated than it is. So hang with me on this. But I created this to talk about kind of that continuum of use from, oh, I'm just experimenting to, oh, no, I'm a responsible user to this is a use disorder. This is problem use. So what I'll have a kid doing. So by the way, I teach this as a preventative lesson. I like to do like show a kid what a problem looks like by taking them interactively through this as a lesson. And I give you a lesson plan for this in your toolkit as well. But to be able to have a kid who's using to kind of circle the things that apply to them. All right, so they might say, well, I use in safe environments and I use with trusted people, but oh yeah, it has affected my health a little bit, or I did get the SRO officer at school, busted me. So they circle the things it applies to, and then that gives you the springboard to talk about again the impact that it's having on them, right? And this is where the harm reduction conversation often comes into play, is that you'll have a kid. It's wonderful where a kid can see in black and white, oh wow, this is causing more crap than I want it to be. I really want to change. How do I do that? But a lot of times a kid will be like, nah, I'm good. I'm gonna keep on doing this, or maybe I'll change, but I really like weed. Okay, so then we bring out our MI tools again and say, all right, well, so I hear that you don't want to stop using entirely, right? So then what are the lines that you refuse to cross, right? What are the limits and the guidelines that you want to make for yourself? And what would that take for you to stay in this responsible use lane? And this is, for those of you working in schools, this is the SBIRT, the Screening, Brief Intervention, and Referral to Treatment. They have several versions of this. They have a nicotine specific and vaping specific one, the Craft N, and this is designed specifically for schools, but this is for folks who have like you're not providing the treatment, right? But you're trying to figure out what kind of help a kid might need. And the values conversation, again, we can bring this out specifically. I have another worksheet that same activity, but then you say, okay, let's take these top values. Let's honestly talk about how your substance use is working for you, how you feel like it's in line with your values, right? And that can again spark some meaty conversation in and of itself. And then how is it conflicting, with these things that matter to you and who you want to be, or how could it if you keep on doing them? And these two, I love these two, MI. I know that we are at time. I've got a little bit more left if you will hang with me. If you need to duck out, again, you'll get a PDF of the slides, and make sure that you get the link to all of the resources that I'm sharing. But I'm gonna keep on going for a few more minutes here. So these MI tools are some of my favorites, especially when you only have 10 minutes with a kid, like I did in a school setting, is starting an interaction with change rulers, which is saying, okay, so just, be honest with me. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you genuinely want to cut back on your vaping? Or how much do you think vaping is negatively affecting your life? Again, on a kind of a 1 to 10 scale. So if a kid says, well, I don't know, let's 4, then that's actually a little golden nugget to work with, right? So why is I'm curious why it's a 4 and it's not a 2. Right? What do you imagine would bring it up to a 7 or an 8, right? So we want to grab any signs of desiring change, right? Or change talk, as we call it in MI. And then 2 roads is another favorite for that resistant kid, I think, that is pre-contemplative, right? That is seemingly like totally cool with their use. So I'll say like, all right, so I hear that you're feeling okay with how you're using right now. Respected. So let's just play this out. So keep on doing things exactly the way that you are. Like, let's just say, what does that look like in 2 weeks, in a couple months, in a couple years down the road? And I will even do this on a piece of paper visually for some kids. And then let's just say you imagine you change one tiny thing about your use, right? Again, I'm not saying you should or you have to, only you can decide whether you do, right? But So make a small change, and maybe it's just not vaping at school, or using, vaping 4 days a week instead of 5. Now let's play that out. How does that look 2 weeks, 2 months, a couple months, couple years down the road in comparison? I'm actually at 100% rate. I have never had a kid not say, well, okay, I could just try a little something. And then what do we know about change, right? Is that once they experience the benefits of that little change, it really ripples into more. So this is a worksheet that I love from Smart Recovery that is kind of along the same lines. It's very MI based, is that it's a cost benefit analysis. So this just has them look at what is the cost and the benefit to my continuing to use, and the cost and the benefit to my changing use. And this can really spark some honest conversations about their hesitations in changing, so that you can address those hesitations and sort of empower them with the tools to go past it. And with this, we're bringing the needs out again, right? So we can have this conversation with our using kids about, all right, tell me what this experience is like when you're using. What are you getting from it that you want? What is it taking away that you don't want? And then we use, again, that empathizing we talked about. I hear that this is really helping you with, fitting in at school, in your new school. And then we do that invitation to, like, well, if people don't have another alternative in their toolbox to cope with their tough feelings, they can get dependent on vaping, or these substances as their only option. Like, are you open to brainstorming some other alternatives with me, and ask permission, as we talked about. And then again, highlighting how it's turning against them potentially, right? As I know you felt that vaping was helping you make friends and meeting this need for belonging, but now I'm hearing you talk about getting this reputation that you don't want, right? We want to highlight that. So there's a lot of tools. Again, a lot of these quit apps that can work for nicotine, and I've also seen kids use it with THC. Talking about peer pressure. When we are being preventative, we are starting as young as possible, right? Is that we know that it's not, doesn't even need to be about drugs. We can be talking about what do you like, not giving in, not like paying attention to that gut feeling in their gut, right? Not doing something just because another kid encouraged you to. Like, we can have those conversations about other things, and it becomes about substances. But we also, and again, these are preventative and intervention discussions, but remember to ask first. Ask them what it looks like and sounds like and feels like to them. This is one of those things we do as adults, is we assume because it looks like the after school special version of peer pressure, or what we experienced, and it doesn't, right? What does it look like for them at 14, at 16, with their friendship group in their school, in 2026? And then asking them questions about, like, well, so, what are you afraid would happen if you chose not to use? And what do you see happening when other kids, say no? Encouraging them to experiment with that. What if you just tried, what if you said no and saw what happened, right? So then we can help them strategize, right? How to handle those situations, because they will say that it is mental. It is mostly messages that they're self-talk about what they think will happen, or what they think they need to do to be accepted. And so then we can help them challenge that self-talk. How true is it? Again, have you experimented, or what have you seen that defies this, and talk them through that and challenge it. Any assertiveness skills, right? They need to know exactly, what does that sound like when I say no? Don't make them role play unless they want to, by the way, but scripting can help for them to like really, what is this? What do I say? We want to check in. I mean, I said this to parents too, but check in before and after situations. So if they're going to prom, or if they're going over to that friend's house and they're like, yeah, this is the friend that I always use with, or I know there's going to be stuff at this party, or right, then we can help them say, all right, so what are you likely to run into there? How are you going to handle that? Let's talk through that. And then check in afterwards. How did it go? What did you use? What went right and wrong? What do we need to kind of tweak for next time? Explore friendships with them. And again, this can be preventative or intervention, is what are real friends to you? What do you do for each other, do to each other? How do you support each other? Because we want to highlight the kind of that discrepancy between when you care about people and you want the best for them, do you hand them or encourage them, influence them to be using these substances that we now know, can go horribly wrong for them, right? And again, use the influence. Well, they want to know how to speak up to their friends often that are going there. They often, kids don't realize, they don't think about, I'm being a negative influence to others now. Like, I started vaping because I went in the bathroom and these other kids were doing it, so I did. When you point out like that they're now that kid, that actually isn't happening in their big picture brain until you point it out sometimes. So, disempowering family influence is that we can have, we want to have these conversations with them about the messages that they get about vaping from their family. And again, this can be preventative as well as a intervention. How has that affected your attitudes? What do you want to kind of inherit and repeat from your family's relationship to vaping and other substances? What do you want to do differently? How are you gonna do that? And then media, and this will be, I think, one of our last pieces, and thanks for hanging on longer, is that kids are inundated with pro-use messages. Is that they're seeing billboards and storefronts and social media ads galore and memes and videos that are promoting nicotine and now THC vapes, right, in our legal state in Connecticut. So we know these industries spend billions of dollars, that they market directly to adolescents, that they speak to them in their values, right? Their agenda is to get lifetime consumers of their products, right? So that they will make mad money. And they use celebrities and influencers. And we know, like I said, that the more kid is plugged in, the more likely they are to use. So we want to ask them these questions. However we do this, about like, what are the messages that you're getting from online and in TV and in your neighborhood when you're driving down the street, right? How do you think that that's influenced you? Especially once they understand that their brain wiring and how it's unconscious, how that wiring happens. I'll get a lot of kids that'll say, yeah, well, it looks like that influencer is so happy, right? It doesn't, it's not doing anything wrong for them. Or look at Snoop. He's a millionaire and has everything anybody would ever want. Right. So here's the challenge is, what do you not know about how use affects that person's life? What are you not seeing? What do you know about how they feel about themselves inside, or what their head does when they're going to sleep at night? How it is to be their kid or their spouse, or if they have any frontal lobe functioning at all, or if they just pay people to do everything. So this is going to be our way in, because they're soaking so much in all of this, and we can't, especially, we're not their parents. We can only influence so much. So we want to help disempower these media forces by getting them to analyze it, look behind the curtain, and see kind of how the sausage is being made there, right? And how the magic tricks are happening. So to look at, like, what are the agendas? Ask, what are the agendas of these companies and these people? What are the strategies that you notice them using? What impact, again, do you think this has on people? And are you aware, again, that they use psychologists and neuroscientists to come up with this stuff, right? What are they telling you that cannabis use or THC, or nicotine is going to do for you? And how true is that? So once they sort of put together, like, oh, now that I know that nicotine actually can make me feel anxious and stressed, and that THC can cause psychosis, like, that's a load of crap. That's when you have them. It's beautiful when they get pissed off at the hypocrisy of it all. You go through their universal adolescent values of hating being controlled, conned, and manipulated, and they love it. This change plan worksheet is something else for you to have in your toolkit. This is just that if a kid says, yeah, I want to make a change, then you can lead them through these simple steps, even in a school setting. You don't have to be a clinician to say, okay, well, what do you want to change? How are you going to do it? What could get in the way? What are the resources that you have? So I lied. This is the last piece. So partnering with parents. I know this is a whole presentation in and of itself, and even with an hour and a half, I'm sorry that we didn't get through all of this fast enough. But I encourage you to watch the parent program. I really, really do that we did the other day, because I talked extensively about these pieces. So the bottom line is that parents are uninformed and misinformed and overwhelmed and under-resourced themselves. So the more that we can coach them in how to set expectations and maintain them and respond when kids are using, and these skills for having like conversations about vaping and substances that actually impact, and I'm giving you tools, by the way, to do this with. There's a bunch of handouts. And when we provide them with the alternatives, with the assessments that they might need to address the underlying reasons why a kid is using, and encouraging them to check their modeling, not judgmentally, right? It's legal for them to be using, but again, just understanding brain wiring. What is your kid picking up from just be aware of what your kid is picking up and wiring from your use. And so, so that they're being more conscientious of that. Discouraging social hosting, right? So we knew this with alcohol for a long time, and now it's happening with THC as well, from well-intended parents who believe that if they allow the use or even provide them with a safe substance on their watch, that's going to be the way to help a kid learn to be responsible, keep them safe. We can empathize with that intention, but all of the research tells us that the more a kid uses more when they use more outside the home when they're allowed to use in the home. When they feel like it's being condoned or allowed, never mind supported by their parent, that's a very mixed, confusing message for them. And it leads to their pro-use attitudes that lead outside the home. And parents are liable if something happens, not just to their kid, because we are required to report that to CPS if we know that a parent is providing them with or allowing them to use on their watch. That's a CPS call for us. So, but they're also liable if a kid hurts them, leaves their setting and goes and freezes to death, like happened in my community, right? They're liable for that. So these are just some handouts that are going to be in your toolkit, so you know what they are. There's things on the teen communication Jedi tips, how to have conversations, how to respond. If you go to my website, that there's my substance use resources. I've got this in there. I did a presentation with Operation Parent on how to step in. But we're going to coach parents again. You'll look at the slides for this, because you can get some more details about this. But we want to teach them how to come from care and how to create consequences that actually help a kid learn and repair and change, not just feel bad, not just take their phone so that it stings. We want, a kid needs to get those needs met in healthy ways. So we want to guide families in doing that. And I'm giving you this mutual trust agreement, which is a template that I use for my coaching clients that helps a family sit down and actually talk through their expectations of each other, their guidelines, and how they're going to support each other in this kid not using. And the kid and the parents saying, here are our expectations, and here's what it's going to take to earn increasing freedom and independence. And the kid saying, this is what I need from you if I'm going to be open and if I'm going to, comply with this. And it's really, I think, a really beautiful template. I just mentioned reporting laws really quickly. You'll have to look at this, but the last thing I want to say, just for you working in schools, this applies to schools as well. So same thing. We want kids to learn, repair, and change when we discover that they're using on our campus. So we want our response to be educational, to be restorative, to be supportive. The punitive stuff is backfiring. So thinking about, how can we, on our watch at school, what can we do to provide this kid with ways to meet these needs that they're meeting through use? What resources can we point the parents towards? What can we help a kid access and engage in? And what can providing education and educational experiences. So I've had schools that brought in the people recovering from addiction. They've brought kids to the lung unit of the hospital. They've had kids do research projects on some of the cases where things have gone wrong. So having cessation on campus. This can be, if you're going to lead them to water and make them want to drink, we got to provide them with the water, right? Having them do community service that's related have the kids that have been busted be part of the focus groups that actually design programming. I'm telling you, they're the best resource to tell us what messaging would need to be heard, what would need to be happening on campus to make a difference in this. So a couple of resources that I'm handing you here are or pointing you towards is the Healthy Futures program that Stanford does. Again, Canva, free, is the best thing I've seen yet to intervene as an intervention program for kids that are using. Just go explore that, deep dive into that. It uses all these MI tools and some of the things that I've pointed out to you. And then American Lung Association has cessation supports for $400. Anybody can get certified to provide that on campus. I've had bus drivers and custodians be the ones that did that because they cared. And then I really encourage you to involve parents. Involve parents in discipline. So wherever you are, is it bringing them in and giving them a kind of a mandatory counseling session where they don't get judged, but you ask, hey, what's going on that I could support you with? You know, how can I help your kids, again, get what they need to help you, parent your kid in this overwhelming world swimming upstream with all of this, that I've had that be actually really, really helpful. The ethical and legal dilemmas for those of you that are working clinically, so you know, I have created a document for you that's going to be in the file. I got to upload it in just a minute, but that actually superimposes all of the Connecticut state laws with the counseling ethics and talking about these areas that are dilemmas. So the short version of what I want to tell you is just make sure that you explain the limits of confidentiality, whatever setting you're in, to your kids and their parents, right? You want to be acting in the best interest of the client and avoiding harm. All of the laws say that. So you want to make sure that you are seeking supervision, you are getting peer consultation, and you are documenting your rationale of why you are making the choices that you are making when you are crossing over some of these confidentiality lines and what you say to who. And again, you'll get some more guidelines on that in your handout. So thank you for holding on extra long. I'm sorry I went way over time. So much information. So I am on social media and I do content for everybody involved in raising kids at Korea Counselor. Counseling with Pizzazz is at my social media for educators specifically, but plug in, reach out to me here, pass this on to folks you work with. And on my website, I have screen health and adolescent brain and substance use resources specifically for parents, educators, and counselors. So go play in all of that